I'm Mark Tokola from KEI, and our guest today is Mr. James Mackey, who's Director of Security Policy and Partnerships at NATO. So thank you, Mr. Mackey, for joining us from Brussels, one of my favorite cities.
It's a pleasure to be here.
This conversation is timely because we're seeing an increasing interest in Europe towards the Indo-Pacific region. And we're seeing increasing interest among Asian countries towards Europe's role. I see that on April 16th, the EU released an Indo-Pacific strategy through a council statement. So this is all very timely. NATO is not synonymous with Europe because the United States and Canada are members. But NATO is certainly one of the key ways that Europe projects power and influence, along with the EU and with the individual European countries. And we cannot forget that many European countries are members of the United Nations Command on the Korean Peninsula today, including the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands, among others. So I thought we might do this conversation in three parts. First, to talk about NATO's remit, and second, to talk about NATO's perception of the security environment in Northeast Asia, and then third, to talk about practical cooperation. So first, I think there's a popular conception that NATO is all about military hardware and military planning to protect Europe. But maybe, James, you could give us a more nuanced appreciation of today's NATO.
Sure, and thanks very much, Mark, for the opportunity to speak with you today. I really appreciate the opportunity to address this forum. I think what I would say in answer to your question is that NATO's job has always been and will remain to defend the security of its allies. Now, how NATO does that has evolved over time as the security situation has evolved. NATO remains strong and relevant to its members because it has adapted over time. So that certainly still involves security challenges from Russia, which unfortunately still continues to launch illegal and destabilizing actions in the Euro-Atlantic space. But there are many other challenges to our security as well, like terrorism, cyber threats, trafficking in weapons and proliferation, and security challenges that arise from climate change. So in addition to what we would say are more traditional challenges to NATO security, we also need to be ready to tackle these new challenges as well. NATO, I think, the best way to describe NATO today and even in the past is really as a platform for NATO member states to coordinate their security. So, of course, there's political coordination that takes place to better understand what's happening and to be able to describe the security concerns we have. But there's also quite a lot of practical coordination that takes place within that platform. And that practical coordination is developing common standards and making sure also that we can operate together when we want to. So we have that platform for the 30 allies, but then we also have a network of more than 40 partner countries from around the world with whom we work, and they range from Mongolia to Colombia. These partners come to NATO to share their expertise and then also to gain insight from the wider network. And I would just sort of end by saying that NATO is not really seeking to be a global organization, but what we are seeking is to be an organization with global connections.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Turning to Northeast Asia, or Asia more generally, does NATO have a perspective about the importance of the region and the security challenges it faces?
Sure. I think let me start by sort of addressing the NATO relationship with Republic of Korea, because we've actually had a strong partnership going all the way back to 2005. NATO and Republic of Korea worked quite closely in Afghanistan, and Korea contributed to NATO's mission in Afghanistan for several years, including contributing to a provincial reconstruction team on the ground. This cooperation continues even today and is now much more focused on ensuring that we have proper support for the Afghan security forces over time. NATO has also been very concerned by the nuclear and missile proliferation activities of the DPRK. Not only does this impact the security of our partner, Republic of Korea, but it also impacts global security and undermines the international rules-based order. And so therefore, it's been of high concern to NATO for quite a number of years. So we regularly consult with Republic of Korea on the DPRK issue. And we also consult with our other close partners in Asia, which are Australia, Japan, and New Zealand. And all of them talk to us about the security challenges they face, as I said, in particular from the DPRK. And then sort of broadening out a little bit more towards Northeast Asia, it's crucial. The region is crucial to global security. The region, I think, also faces many of the same challenges that we face in the Euro-Atlantic region. There's nuclear and missile proliferation, as I already mentioned. There is real lack of confidence and security building mechanisms in the region, and a lack of effective arms control measures. And I think we see continuing and in fact increasing challenges to the international rules-based order and to multilateral institutions. So we at NATO see it as very important to consult with like-minded countries, to share our concerns, to exchange information and expertise, and to really talk about what all of us can do to support the international system, which, as I said, we think is being challenged on multiple fronts. And so NATO really takes a very active interest in the security of Northeast Asia, while recognizing that NATO really is not going to be an actor in that security architecture, because there are existing institutions and forums in which security is discussed for the Northeast Asia region.
Okay, I see that in December of 2020, South Korea joined a NATO foreign ministers meeting for the first time ever, along with Australia and Japan and the EU and some others. Can you tell us what happened at that meeting?
Sure. In December, we had a really good exchange of views with all of that list of partners that you just mentioned. And as I mentioned in my previous answer, I think we really focused that discussion on the challenges that we see across the globe to the international rules-based order. And that comes from multiple actors, both state and non-state actors, who sort of seek to undermine the international system, which has provided stability, security, and prosperity for all of us over many decades, and which we think is worth preserving and strengthening. While we're each responsible for security in our own regions, I think we need to compare notes and talk about how we can support each other. In terms of some of the concrete cooperation that we discussed in that meeting, I think a number of ideas have come up and were certainly discussed in that meeting. Let me just sort of list a few that I think would be of interest to your viewers. First was arms control and confidence and security building measures, sort of comparing how that's working in Northeast Asia versus how that's working in the Euro-Atlantic realm, and sort of what ideas we can share with each other. We're also looking very much to deepen cooperation on cyber defense issues, which is a global challenge we all face today. We're also looking to deepen our cooperation in the ability to respond to chemical, biological, radiological threats to our societies. And finally, we are looking to deepen our cooperation on emerging and disruptive technologies, like autonomous weapon systems, the use of artificial intelligence in warfare, and military activity in space. We need to begin to talk now about global norms, confidence and security building measures, and eventually arms control agreements in all of these areas. And it's really in everyone's interest that we prevent an arms race in these new areas of technology. And so in addition to sort of a political touch base with some of our closest partners, we also use the December meeting to try and sort of flesh out a little bit some of those ideas in terms of how we think we could work together in those areas in the future.
Yeah, this is a very nuts and bolts question, but just to be clear, how do countries actually talk to NATO? Is this military to military, or does NATO have a civilian dialogue it carries on too?
Sure, it's both. NATO is a civil military organization, and actually the key decision-making body is the North Atlantic Council, which is composed of the ambassadors of the 30 member states. And we have all of our partner countries, as well as our allies, actually have an embassy here in Brussels, which works directly with NATO. And so first and foremost is a civilian-to-civilian contact to be able to talk about the political aspects of the relationship and political dialogue. That is then, of course, complemented by military-to-military contacts. And so we have an international military staff and a NATO military structure, which also works directly with their counterparts in allied countries, but also in partner countries as well. And so actually it covers the full realm of civil and military interaction. And quite often we're actually doing these meetings together where both the civilian and the military are in the same room talking about how we advance the cooperation. And so at the Republic of Korea Embassy here in Brussels, we work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs colleagues, but there are also the Defense Attaché and a number of colleagues as well who work directly with our military authorities to talk about sort of the practical military to military cooperation.
Okay, one thing we're seeing at KEI is blurring the line between traditional security and economic issues. It seems like now, like you mentioned, artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, but even supply chains of semiconductors or medical supplies, or does NATO see a line between traditional security, which it works on, and the new economic security issues?
I think it's difficult actually for anyone to draw those lines right now because I think as we saw in the pandemic and we've seen sort of intentions over supply chains with regard to computer chips and other things over the past couple of years. I think all of us need to look at sort of comprehensive view of security. But I think it's also important, and we're very cognizant of this at NATO, is that we need to make sure that we focus on an area where we as NATO can contribute. And that's primarily in the military aspects of security, not necessarily the more civilian aspects of security. And so NATO works quite closely with our European Union colleagues downtown when we talk about things like control of critical infrastructure or cyber defense, because clearly there is a certain element of it which is I would say related to how we as a military operate and how we can speak to each other in a crisis as NATO allies. But then if we talk about cyber defense or cyber activity, it very quickly moves into the civilian sphere and also the private sector sphere. And that's much more a strength of the European Union. And so we have to work sort of hand in glove with our EU colleagues to try and figure out who has the best added value in which area. And in general, I think where we will come down is that NATO is looking at the defense and military aspects of it. So NATO is not necessarily looking at the deployment of 5G infrastructure in our societies, but what NATO is looking at is how is 5G being used in defense and military applications so that we as militaries can talk to each other and we can operate, because we need to be able to operate when and if our security is challenged. And so if we're reliant on a certain type of system or we are reliant on certain supply chain, it's very important for us to understand what that supply chain is, where potential vulnerabilities are, and then work together to try and address those vulnerabilities. And I think one thing that we've certainly seen, and this is a lesson from the civilian world that we're pulling over more into the military, is that it's not necessarily about having one supply chain that's distinct from every other supply chain. What's really important is to have multiple supply chains so that if there's a failure on one, that you have multiple other areas to go. And we certainly saw this with personal protective equipment and other things during the pandemic. And I think we're taking a very similar approach too, is that it's not about having one supply chain which is separate from another. It's about having multiple different supply chains so that everyone has access to the equipment and the information and the technology that they need.
Mm-hmm. It turns out to have been both convenient and important that the EU and NATO are both headquartered in Brussels. Makes it easier to talk.
Indeed. And you would think for as long as the two organizations have been here that the relationship would be much closer. But I have to say that there is certainly institutional competition over the years and certain political challenges. But I think in the last 5 or 6 years, we've really seen a dramatic increase in cooperation between the two organizations. And we actually have 74 areas of work that we've agreed between the joint areas of work between the two organizations. And it ranges anything from military mobility to cyber defense and other activities. And so my team meets quite regularly with their EU counterparts. I would say almost every other week we have some sort of a meeting to sort of talk about what we can do together to try and advance sort of our joint interests. We have 22 members of the EU who are also members of NATO, but there's not complete overlap. Obviously, there are some divergences. United States, Canada, Norway, Turkey are all members of NATO, but not members of the European Union. But I think we realize we've got very close shared interests and values with the EU, and so it's important for us to have a good, strong relationship.
Mm-hmm. It's an evolving relationship.
Indeed.
Before I turn to some audience questions that came in advance, let me ask one very Korea-specific question, which is, does NATO have a perspective on the threat that North Korea poses in particular? I mean, it might surprise people to know that Brussels is actually closer to Pyongyang than is Los Angeles. Europe is not that far away.
Indeed. And I have to say, actually, that oftentimes when we discuss this with our South Korean colleagues, they're very clear about showing us, where the range of the various new capabilities are from DPRK. And I think that there is a very strong appreciation within NATO for the challenge that missile proliferation presents. And NATO actually, as part of our collective defense, our Article 5 collective defense, is responsible for defending allies against missile strikes. And so the fact, as you said, that Brussels is closer to Pyongyang than Los Angeles is really ensures that allies are going to be very aware of the fact that this type of proliferation really represents a challenge to all of Euro-Atlantic security and not just to, say, Asia-Pacific security. And so we have, as I said, even since 2005, we've been engaging with Seoul on these issues. And it started really with Afghanistan, but then I think as the challenge of DPRK grew and grew over time, and we certainly saw a number of both missile tests and nuclear tests, I think that really sort of brought to the fore the need to talk about this issue. And so we've had a number of occasions where the North Atlantic Council has made clear public statements condemning nuclear tests or proliferation by DPRK. And we've also seen some joint statements, too, where NATO allies with the 4 Asia-Pacific partners that I mentioned before, so Republic of Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, have also made public statements encouraging the regime in Pyongyang to return to negotiations, pursue a peaceful solution. And all of us, I think, share this goal of an eventual denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I think all of us believe that that's a good, strong goal that we can pursue and that would actually be of benefit to regional and global security.
Okay, as I said, we did receive some questions from the audience in advance, so let me pose those to you if I may.
Sure.
The first one is, how can NATO and Korea cooperate on non-traditional challenges such as cybersecurity and disinformation?
Well, I think actually in this case, for the non-traditional challenges, it's almost even easier than the traditional challenges. Because obviously there's a huge distance between Seoul and Brussels. It's not really cost effective to send NATO troops to East Asia to do exercises and training. Likewise, it's not very cost effective to send troops from Korea to Europe in order to train. But if we're talking about non-traditional challenges like cyber defense and disinformation, that's much more in the information space. And so those are areas where we can certainly work very closely together. And in fact, Korea has been involved actively in a number of NATO exercises that focus on cyber defense. And this is an effort to really try and sort of share information and to be able to share expertise. And we certainly understand that Korea and our other partners in the Asia-Pacific region bring a great deal of expertise and experience in this field. And so it's of great benefit for NATO to actually work with these partner countries. And I think all of us then are stronger for that, because then when an eventual crisis happens, and certainly in the cyber sphere, but also in the disinformation sphere, it doesn't respect national boundaries. We're talking about regional and in fact global challenges here. And so the more interoperable we are, the better able we are to work together, and we need to practice working together before the actual crisis hits. And so I think particularly in non-traditional challenges, there's a huge scope for NATO and Korea to work together.
Our second audience question is, does NATO assess that South Korea faces security challenges other than those posed by North Korea?
I certainly think so. I mean, I think South Korea is in fact a member of State of the World and a key regional actor in Northeast Asia. And so I think that South Korea, by default, unfortunately, all of us, all states, face wider challenges. it's certainly clear that DPRK represents the most immediate threat to South Korea's security, but South Korea as a democratic nation and an open society faces many of the same challenges all of many other of our democratic and open societies face. And you mentioned a couple of them: cybercrime, disinformation. I think certainly chemical biological terrorism or radiological terrorism is also something we're all very concerned about. But I also think that South Korea, as a member in good standing of the global community, also understands that all of us need to support the international rules-based order. And so when we have violations of territorial integrity, or we have violations of human rights, or we have actions which in fact lead us closer to an escalation of conflict rather than de-escalation of conflict, that actually harms all of our interests. And that certainly is just as true for Korea as it is for the NATO countries. And so I think that's certainly also something we're talking about. It's the relationship and the discussions we have with Seoul are certainly much broader than just discussions of DPRK, although certainly those discussions remain a focus for us.
Mm-hmm. And so my final audience question is, does NATO see its cooperation with South Korea as general assistance to a fellow democracy, or does it believe it shares with South Korea common security threats?
I don't want to I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think I actually am going to answer the good political scientist answer, which is both. Because I certainly think that South Korea shares the values of the NATO member states. It's a liberal democracy. It's a member in good standing of the United Nations. It's an open society, which is based largely on the same type of open economy, liberal economy that we have. And so therefore, we do feel a real kinship with South Korea in terms of the values that we share. And I think we also certainly share a strong belief and strong support for the United Nations and things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I think that is really the basis. And we talked a little bit earlier about sort of NATO being a political military organization. And in fact, the political part of the organization comes first. The values and ideals and the liberal values on which the treaty is based, the Washington Treaty of 1949, actually come first before there's any discussion about military activity or common defense. It's about shared values. And so we certainly feel kinship with Republic of Korea on that. At the same time, I actually do think that we share some common security concerns. And we certainly mentioned the DPRK missile challenge, the DPRK nuclear proliferation challenge, which we at NATO very much see as a global challenge. This is not a Northeast Asia challenge alone. It represents a threat to global security and stability. And so therefore, we as NATO need to be aware and informed of what's happening. But as I mentioned, many of the other challenges that we also see, challenges to the law of the sea, territorial integrity, and the rules-based international order are also things that we share. And just to stress what I sort of said at the beginning too, is I don't necessarily think we will see NATO as being an active participant in these challenges in East Asia. NATO remains a regional security organization, and so our focus is always going to be on the Euro-Atlantic area. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't exchange ideas and information and be able to work together when we want to with countries in other regions. And so for us, that's the real rationale behind our regional engagement in Northeast Asia, but specifically our engagement with Republic of Korea, is that we do see both political affiliation or political closeness, but also a real belief that we share some common security challenges and that we are stronger when we work together on those shared challenges.
Okay, I think you explained that clearly, and it makes perfect sense. Let me ask about one specific issue, though, where maybe NATO's interests would be engaged. That's freedom of navigation. Mm-hmm. So does NATO see that there are Indo-Pacific issues involved in sea lanes, maybe South China Sea, that affect its interests?
For sure, and this gets to sort of, I would say, the belief now, or I would say it's certainly something that we are seeing here, is that a challenge to the rules-based order in one region of the world has implications in other regions of the world. So if we see freedom of navigation and the law of the sea challenged in East Asia, it has implications for us in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, in the Arctic. And so I think that's also why, for instance, when we saw Russia's annexation of Ukraine in 2014, our Asia-Pacific partners were extremely concerned by this, even though that's many thousands of kilometers away from East Asia. But I think they understood inherently that the invasion and violation of territorial integrity and the invasion of a neighboring country sets a terrible precedent for all of us everywhere. And so all of us believe quite strongly in the UN value system and the UN regulations and international norms and laws. And so I think it was very clear to our partners in Asia Pacific that a challenge in Europe to these values and norms would also set a bad precedent, would weaken those values and norms in East Asia. And it's the same thing for NATO when we look at East Asia, whether it's the East China Sea or the South China Sea. We certainly see violations on freedom of navigation and other violations of the law of the sea as something that's of great concern to us, because it weakens all of our collective security. And as I said, this is a system that we believe has helped us to achieve peace and prosperity globally for all actors globally, not just a subset of actors. All actors have benefited from this system, and we think there's a real strong case to be made for us to continue to shore up that system. Likewise, just to touch briefly again on the arms control issue, if we see a challenge to confidence and security building measures, or we see a weakening of the arms control regime in Europe, that also, I think, sets a bad example for potential arms control that we could see in East Asia in the future. And again, that's something which the states of East Asia themselves will have to decide. But if it's clear that arms control regimes are weakened in Europe, that sets a very bad precedent for the future stability or the ability to negotiate such regimes in the future. And I think it's certainly no one would deny that arms control can bring greater stability and security, and it's something we should sort of focus on in many regions of the world today.
Okay, thank you, James Mackey, for a fascinating conversation. I think Americans underappreciate the importance of the Europe-Asia relationship. It's one we're going to have to understand better, and you've certainly helped us do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and thanks very much. Take care.
You too.